I wanted to talk about this segment off of Morning Joe that left me baffled. Now, Waleed Shahid, he posts a lot of pro-Palestine content. So seeing him post a grilling of an Israeli politician is not surprising to me. But what is surprising to me is the source, which is The Morning Joe on MSNBC. Well, MSNBC is considered a left-wing platform, liberal platform in American standards. It was still for like mainstream left-wing. It was mainstream liberalism. It wasn't, up until very recently, that frequently this aggressive in critique of the Israeli state. That's not to say it never engaged in it, or they never had people on like Mehdi Hassan before, you know, that clash with Mehdi Hassan, who were critical of the Israeli state. But to see the grilling of this guy, I watched the first 3 minutes of this. I stopped and said, I have to watch this live, because the guy who's grilling him isn't even like the resident left-wing, you know, liberal type, the left, or like left-wing. Oh, is it a sock dem? Oh my God. Whoa, this one used the word socialist. This was the resident right-winger. You know how different shows on Fox News, you'll see on Fox and Friends, they have like one Democrat to be the Democrat, either to act as the punching bag or to be like, look, we're more balanced. But I mean, a lot of times that person is chosen specifically to flop. Well, they have that, not that they chose this person specifically to flop, but they have that for MSNBC as well. They have the chosen like right winger who's not for Trump, but still a principled conservative, but the party's gotten out of control. And he's the guy who starts grilling him, and he grills him with this type of, his demeanor is almost like, it was almost like a parent talking to a child who had made a mess, or a parent talking to a dog who had made a mess and trying to rub their nose in it. The tone he had was what I think left me most aghast, because like if he said it in a different tone, maybe it would have came off better, but his tone was just so aggressive. I don't want to explain it anymore because I feel like I'm building it up too much. Let's just watch.
Mr. Minister, about the number of civilian deaths.
To be clear, this is the Netanyahu government's economic minister.
Yes, among the Gazan population. Not only that, but the famine that now has taken place because Gaza is cut off. Again, no one contests what you're saying about Hamas. We say it every day on this show and have for a very long time, especially after the hideous attack of October 7th. But is Israel concerned about the human suffering inside Gaza, number one, and the number of civilian deaths that have been incurred since this attack began?
We're concerned about 134 hostages. Here's a picture of some of them. These girls are under tunnels for half a year, raped, tortured. This is what we're concerned about. We're concerned about those victims in Israel that were murdered, slaughtered, little children that were put in the oven, women that were raped and killed while they were raped by terrorists, by jihadists. So we're concerned about those. How do we eliminate these folks? And by the way, they're funded. They're funded by Qatar and Iran.
Yeah, they are.
He's not even answering the question. Like the host leads with, we understand the suffering of the hostages, and he brings it back to the hostages when the question was about the hostages. He didn't even mention the question. It's almost as if the host didn't even ask the question. It's like the host asked a totally different question. He's answering the question it's he wish he heard.
Yes,
Qatar is a big enemy of Israel.
They are, Mr. Mayor. Mayor, can I ask you a question? I'm so glad you brought that up. So I have always looked at Hamas.
Now they're moving on. He didn't even answer the question. Okay, but this is the tone that I'm talking about. This guy, listen to this.
Can I ask you a question? I'm so glad you brought that up. So I have always looked at Hamas as Nazis. They're terrorists. Have you always looked at Hamas as Nazis?
Unfortunately, yes, and it was demonstrated October 7 what they do.
Yeah, so you always have. Have most of the Israeli people always looked upon Hamas as Nazis?
Well, you know, some of the people in Israel, because we seek peace, thought maybe one day they will prefer peace than war. October 7.
What about Benjamin Netanyahu? What about him? Has he always looked upon Hamas as Nazis?
Well, you're talking about Qatar or Hamas? Hamas. I think that everyone understands.
What's interesting about this is I immediately saw where the host was going when he started to say this the first time in the pre-screening when I was looking at this, trying to decide if we're going to react to it. And I feel like the guest, the economic minister, realized it at the same speed I was realizing it, and you can see how he goes from in the first round like, absolutely, we all knew they were Nazis, to, well, you know, many of us in Israel, it shifts in the tone, because I think he knows that he's going to ask about the Doha money. He knows he's going to ask about the money that Benjamin Netanyahu gave the go-ahead to Hamas. He can feel it building up, and he can feel the tone. So I feel like what happened is we both felt the tone in his voice, the tone in the host, and we started searching, and we found it at the same time. If the host would have just used a slightly different tone, I feel like he really could have snuck it up a lot smoother. Anyway, back. But you could tell he's obviously annoyed.
What about Benjamin Netanyahu? What about him? Has he always looked upon Hamas as Nazis?
Well, you're talking about Qatar or Hamas? Hamas. I think that everyone understands that Hamas's charter is to destroy Israel, and by the way, not only Israel.
So you've always known this. I mean, yeah, we know the charter.
Yes.
So let me ask you this question, and I can't get an answer, and maybe we're just not covering it in the press. Maybe you can help me out. Why did Benjamin Netanyahu send the head of Mossad to Doha 3 weeks before the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, and told Qatar to continue funding Hamas?
I think, if anything, October 7 shattered that concept. And it's my understanding.
But you just said you always knew they were Nazis. I always knew they were Nazis. I would never give. We were always angry that Qatar funded Hezbollah and Hamas. I want to know, why did Benjamin Netanyahu do that? Let me ask you this. Why did Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump know in 2018 the sources of Hamas's illicit funding, and they still did nothing? They wanted that money to get to Hamas. I'd like to know why, because we don't know in America. Have there been any?
What's interesting? You want to know what this feels like to me? Right now, there's a lot of ways you could critique an Israeli minister if you bring him on to a morning show. I mean, a million different ways. I would probably be focusing on the World Central Kitchen strike, saying this area was supposed to be deconflicted. If it's a deconflicted area, and we all agree it's a deconflicted area, why are any bombs even falling in this area? I mean, you could talk about them being innocent, but what about the fact that there shouldn't be bombs in this area in the first place? Like, there's a million different ways you could go after a minister at this point in time, and he's choosing to go the route of, hey, you know, in the lead up to this war, here's a failure. You guys, if you guys always knew they were evil, like you just said, why were you going ahead on all this money for evil? Now, this is not what I would focus on, but I don't think the minister has much of a response, because much of the conversation about the failures leading up to the 7th, it feels like the Netanyahu government wants to move that conversation until after the war. Now, remember, Netanyahu was a security candidate. He was a security guy. If you go back and you look at any of his campaign ads, if you look at any of his campaign ads from any of his runs to be in charge of the country, it was heavily it was heavily leaning into the idea that Netanyahu is the only person who can keep Israel safe. He has a watchful eye. He has an eye for security. I remember there was this one ad where Netanyahu was the lifeguard on the beach, and people were running, and Netanyahu would say, stop. And then all of a sudden, Netanyahu would teleport here, and then he'd teleport there, and he'd do all this safety stuff because he was the safety guy. And when you think about it, Netanyahu is the longest running prime minister, longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. There's nobody that served longer than him. So when he's the security guy, and he's been running the security state for as long as I can remember, I mean, I'm 23, right? I haven't been alive for that long, but all I remember is Netanyahu, and then one other prime minister, because when I was really young, it was somebody else, but like one tiny, I think it was Benny Gantz's prime ministership. He has been the one who built the security state as the security prime minister, and it failed. If you're Donald Trump and you have the worst undocumented immigrant migration crisis under your leadership, then obviously that's going to be pretty embarrassing if you're the, I'm going to stop all the undocumented people, I'm going to stop them all, and then you don't stop them all. It's like, oof, well, it looks like you failed. And so instead of having the conversation about what led to these failures, because I would say that you should understand what led to the failures if they're going to lead you through a period of immense crisis, they want to move that conversation to after the war, just like they want to move the conversation of elections until after the war, just like they want to move the conversation about everything until after the war. Where will the war end? Well, we don't know. Just move the conversation about whether this is the right government to lead the country generally until after the period of immense crisis where decades of history is being decided in weeks of time. You know, they talk about like there are decades where it feels like nothing happens, and there are weeks where it feels like everything happens. This is one of those times in history where it feels like everything's happening at once, and they're holding on to power with a vice grip. They did a coalition government, yes, but all these conversations, which could shake the Israelis' public's confidence in this government to even lead them to the end of the war, which is the one thing where the Israeli public is still like, well, I don't know. Would it be kind of chaotic to move it until during the war? I mean, after the war, of course, but during, I don't know. If they were to know more about these failures, would they continue to say that this is the government that would lead them? So I think it's good to have questions like this asked now, like, hey, if you guys were funding the people you want to fight now, I mean, should we give the people who were funding the people you're now fighting the chance to do that fight if they've showed that they've supplied the issue?
Any investigations in Israel at this point?
I'm sure we'll investigate it, and I totally agree with you. That Qatar is a wolf in sheep's clothes, and they're buying their way in.
No. I must correct you. Benjamin
Please.
Netanyahu was asked by the leaders of Qatar, do you want us, Qatar, to give money to Hamas? This was in September. And Netanyahu's representative said, yes, of course. You're feeding that wolf, and you're telling that wolf to feed the Nazis in Gaza. So explain to me, because I really want to know, why was Benjamin Netanyahu and his government funding? They were out.
Like if we're gonna be doing the Nazi comparisons, everybody says they're sick of the World War II comparisons. But if we're there, let's stay there. Wouldn't it have been really, really embarrassing if what they're saying is true, that Hamas is, Nazis? They're basically Nazis. They can only exist in a world where they're destroying Israel, destroying the Jews, destroying the Jewish people. If that is true, then would there have been a world where a Jewish state during the World War II period would be giving the go-ahead to give finances to the Nazi regime, to Adolf Hitler's regime? Now, if you go to certain groups back then, like the Lahai, which was thinking about said things, then, I mean, there are some groups that'd be okay with it, but I think the vast majority of people would say, okay, that's probably a terrible thing to do. If you're a Jewish state, you should not be funding anti-Semitic states that are sponsoring violence against Jews. So if that's the case, why was Netanyahu's government doing that? Was there another purpose involved? Was there another motivation? What was that motivation?
Allies with...
Was it dividing the Palestinian politics? Was it dividing the Palestinian people, making it more difficult for the creation of a state? Was the main security there Israel and the Israeli people's imminent security, or dividing the Palestinian public?
Qatar in the funding of Hamas. Why?
I think it's a mistake, and it was uncovered October 7th. October 7th demonstrated that if you think you could buy quiet, peace, by funding Hamas, it's a huge mistake. And it's clear to me right now.
Why did Benjamin Netanyahu, knowing that their charter said that they were to kill Jews and eradicate Israel, why would any leader of Israel work to fund that organization to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars and work with Qatar to fund Hamas?
I think that question should be asked, and we'll get an answer. We'll ask.
When are we going to get the answer? We've been asking.
I'm sorry, it's just a baffling response. Yeah, he just railed into Netanyahu, like, why did he fund them with millions and millions of dollars? If they're the Nazis, why would he give millions of dollars to Nazis? And his response is, man, that's a great question. Yeah, that was a good question. You're a good journalist. You should get a raise.
For 6 months. When are we going to get the answer?
At the end of the day, once we finish the war, all these channels will rise and we'll deal with them. Right now, we're focused on winning the war. And I want to make sure.
I need to ask you another question.
Please.
I want to ask you another question because you brought this up.
Telling you, man, it's literally just they want to move all of this conversation until after the war. Don't ask any of the, wow, we're in a security crisis. I wonder if we should ask questions about what got us in the security crisis to know if these are the people that should lead us through the security crisis. Like think about it from a different perspective. During the Civil War, when I think like McClellan, the leader of the, I'm trying to remember if his name was, yeah, it was McClellan, George McClellan. Lincoln looked at his performance, and even if he was beloved by the troops, he had to look at his performance and judge, well, if McClellan should continue to lead us through the crisis. He had to make that judgment. Now, wouldn't it have been silly if they're all sitting at the table about, hey, this McClellan guy, I mean, you know, there's all these other guys like this Ulysses S. Grant guy and all these, what do you think we should do with all these fellas? What do you think we should do? What should we change them? And then somebody stands up and says, no, McClellan stands up and says, whoa, 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 whoa. We should have this conversation after the war. Now, I understand that that's like military administration and political administration is different. But if the political administration is making decisions that affects the military administration, like building the security state, which Netanyahu did, longest serving prime minister in history, there should be questions about that to lead them through a security crisis or to build the foundation for peace afterwards. If they were part of the problem and fucking up this foundation in the first place, fucking it up and continuing to keep it fucked up, then maybe they shouldn't be part of the conversation of, hey, what is a treaty? What is a deal we can work around, some compromise we can work around to have long-term peace? Because when the Saudis are giving a thumbs up to a deal where they agree to rebuild Gaza, where they agree to take on that economic toll, they agree to a future Palestinian state vaguely in the future, no timetable, while it's demilitarized, with all the hostages returned. If that is the deal that's being offered, and we have polling data that suggests the majority of the Israeli public would be in favor of that deal, and Netanyahu and his government, due to its far-right characteristics and the weird fucking mishmash of freaks that is contained in this coalition, cannot even begin to consider that deal, then that's a problem. And I'm not saying an immediate political change would fix that problem. Maybe we're just slightly pushing in the right direction. Maybe it would somehow stay the same due to gridlock or whatever. But by God, I know this isn't working, and I'd much rather roll the dice. And I think if people had the security conversation, maybe a lot of the Israeli public would decide to roll the dice right now to have somebody who's better at building the foundations for peace and security, since the guy who's in charge of security right now messed it up.
Yes.
You brought it up, and it is so sickening to think about the Israeli women that were beaten, raped, murdered, the Israeli grandmothers who were burned to death, the toddlers who were shot in their beds for 10 hours. Some of these people waited for Benjamin Netanyahu's government to come and rescue them. Those people whose faces you were holding up, they sat and they waited in shelters. Their children saw their parents shot. Parents saw some children shot. And they kept waiting for Netanyahu's government to come rescue them. 2, 3, 4, 7, 10, in some cases 13 hours. Where was Benjamin Netanyahu? Where was the IDF? Where were the defense forces over those 12, 13 hours while the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust was unfolding within 40, 50 miles of
This is the Morning Joe. This is the morning Joe, man. Imagine you wake up, you're like, I need my coffee. I got my bagel. Oh, my cream cheese. Oh, hey, dog, how's it going? You sit on the couch, you turn on the morning Joe, and then this is the first thing you hear.
4, 7, 10, in some cases 13 hours. Where was Benjamin Netanyahu? Where was the IDF? Where were the defense forces over those 12, 13 hours while the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust was unfolding within 40, 50 miles of Netanyahu?
Dude, this is the morning Joe. This is the morning Joe. There has been a major rhetorical shift in the conversations that are permitted to be shown and permitted to be had on mainstream TV, on mainstream media, whether it was just the uptick in social media interaction and just huge boost in interactions online that vastly ticked what was being shown on mainstream TV, that motivated them for the viewership to move over, whether it was some ideological shift, whether it was to just the horror of a lot of the slaughter, if it was the Orthodox Church bombing, whether there's recent Central Kitchen bombing, but whether it was Chuck Schumer taking this recent dive out rhetorically and going directly after the Netanyahu government. Whatever it is, I think it's a culmination of factors. The rhetorical shift is real. Now, to be specific, this is an attack on Netanyahu in some direction for not being hawkish enough on Hamas. But on the other hand, due to how he's attacking it, due to this specific angle, he is attacking it in a way where it's not just focused on, oh, he should have been more hawkish here. You could also think of it like, well, if there was no way to negotiate with any Palestinian authority, if this guy was giving them money, like, what was his motivation? Was his motivation, if these guys are like Nazis, what was his other motivation? Could it have been to keep, and this could open the conversation, to keep the Palestinian people divided, to stop a state? Because now the Israeli government, even when it's like on the precipice of going on and taking the final holdout in Rafah, it's still not really having any conversation about a future Palestinian state because like, oh, we don't want to reward it. I mean, when we were going to occupy Germany, would it have been silly at some point to be like, what will a future German state look like? We don't want to reward Germany after doing what it just did with us. I mean, we have to at some point agree that the German people, the Palestinian people, I know this is not a one-to-one comparison, but any group of people, the Japanese people, Korean people, American, Canadian, French, Japanese, all people deserve representation. That should be a basic American value. I mean, at least from my perspective as an American, it should be the value of everyone to have a state that represents them, some body that they can report to talk about their issues, to solve local issues, from speed bumps to overcrowding in schools, to health issues, to healthcare issues, to whatever it is. And that doesn't exist if there's the checkpoints from point A to point B, a government that doesn't respect them. They're not able to have elections. They haven't had elections in forever. In the Gaza Strip, I think it hasn't been since 2006. In the West Bank, when we're talking about Jerusalem, a lot of this is, I mean, how much power does that person that's elected actually have? Anyway, moving on, let's get back to this, but this is the conversation that can't be put off anymore if you're going to talk about building the foundations for a stable peace, because this is a conversation that needs to be had in order to have that stable peace.
Let me answer you. We will investigate that. We were caught by surprise. And there are many faults. Let
me ask you
both
this.
of the army and the government.
How could you be caught by surprise? How could you be caught by surprise when you had Hamas's plans for a year? Netanyahu had Hamas's terror attacks for a year. Why didn't they act on it?
These faults will be uncovered, and there are many challenges, and we will investigate everything. Honestly, believe me, everyone in Israel, right, left, we all want to go down to to investigate, have deep investigations on this issue, okay? But this is not the time. Right now, we have to focus on winning the war. With all due respect, this is not the time to interrogate and ask these questions. And I agree we should ask these questions.
With all due respect, I would say if Israel, a country that is absolutely necessary to freedom and democracy in the Middle East, in the world, if Israel...
Necessary? I mean, I don't really see how necessary. Like, when Ukraine was asking for support, Israel more than dragged its feet. Like, I don't know. I feel like that was a major democratic issue that was being brought to question. State going towards democracy, trying to protect its territory, being encroached upon a state that wanted to force a different system of government, that wanted to bring it back into its sphere of influence by force. And Israel and the Netanyahu government dragged his feet, didn't want to support Ukraine really all that much, if at all. I think the only support they've gotten really of date is help with early warning systems. Still no weapons capacity or anything. Even before October 7th, before the weapons became, much more important to the Israeli government's interests at the moment. I mean, why specifically are they integral here? I just don't see it. I'm trying to think of like the operation that they try. I just don't see it. I don't see the integralness here. Oh,
has been led in this position by a leader that allowed all of these things to happen. How in the world do you trust?
Look, and I'm not saying that there isn't security interests. You could be like, well, Israel's intelligence sharing. You'd be like, okay, the intelligence sharing. Well, there's a bunch of things. But when you talk about like integral to democracy, I'm trying to think like the only ways you could make the argument is by specifically they enhance our capabilities through things like intelligence sharing. But then that's just like but like at that point, you could be making the argument that anything that strengthens the United States necessarily is a win for democracy. But I mean, I don't think that would be a good path to go down.
That leader to make the right decisions in the most important war since 1973.
Well, we're a democracy, and we have our rules, and we obey the rules of democracy. And right now, the Israeli government, and by the way, the war cabinet, which is expanded, including the folks that were on opposition, were all united to win the war. And we want to focus, with your permission, not on what was wrong on October 7th or what led to it. Many mistakes, many problems. We're putting all that aside at this point, and we're all united winning the war. And I want to emphasize, we got to bring back those 134 hostages that are sitting right now in the tunnels, raped, tortured. It's just terrible. And I think the world should focus on that. And number two,
answers.
Focus on that wolf in sheep's clothes. That's, of course, Qatar. And
to be clear, every answer to every question has been him responding to questions that seemingly haven't even been asked.
Iran, that are funding it, giving safe haven to Hamas leaders. This should be off the chart, and we must realize that they're a big enemy of Israel. And let's right now focus on to win the war. When we finish the war, all these questions will arise,
by the way,
and we will deal with them all.
They funded Hamas for years through Netanyahu's direction.
And I want to ask a question about that, because every victim in this has been mentioned by you, sir, except for civilians starving in Gaza. And I just want to point out that you never, even when asked, you didn't mention that. I'm not going to ask because I've heard. But I want to ask you, given the questions that Joe has just raised and given the gravity of the situation, is Benjamin Netanyahu fit to lead at this moment?
First of all, I do have to answer, we don't want anybody, any civilian, to suffer. And we collaborate with the world, funding, helping the innocent people in Gaza, that 80% of them.
What the what was that? Whoa. The innocent. So is he can't even just call, like, there's not going to, in his lexicon, exist innocent Palestinians? Is in his lexicon, to be clear, When we talk about civilians who are not armed combatants, he is not going to talk about them as if they were innocent without doing that, to cast doubt on their innocence. I don't care how, like, oh, well, what he really means is that they voted for, you know, a political body. By the way, majority of the people in Gaza were not alive. Were not alive when that vote took place. So you cannot, and a lot of them were also very young when that vote took place and couldn't have voted. And so the minority in Gaza even voted in that election. And much of the people who did vote didn't vote for Hamas, right? Hamas has centralized control since then. To do this, and not only is it wrong, I think just in the politics of it, even though you can find people who do, you know, agree with the attack of October 7th, even if I was to give his argument all credibility and discount everything I just said about the nuances and just say, well, if you find this one poll, it's a 60% are angry at Israel and want to fight them. Even in that scenario, they're still innocent civilians. And you still should treat them as innocent civilians. And as a minister of a government, you should not be casting doubt on that, because it makes us question how dedicated you are really to protecting them if you can't even accept the idea of an innocent civilian.
70-80% of them support October 7th. We don't want anybody to starve or anything. And we will be helpful to the world, collaborating and helping them. And by the way, there's no president, no presidents in the world, when you have a war, that you help your enemy. This is the first time in all wars that Israel is willing to help the Gazan people not to starve. We want to make sure that they move away. When we enter Rafah, we're telling them, move aside. Don't give shelter to the terrorists and you'll be safe. If you give shelter to terrorists, you're at risk. And no other army in the world has such, honesty and consideration of our enemies. And this is something we're proud of and we'll continue doing.
No other enemy. No other army. No other army. Send him a sticker.